Okay, this video is about methionine and advanced glycation end products go together in foods and why this is a major observation that can help you to age better and decrease risk of diabetes complications, and cancer. So this ends up being really interesting. This picture drawing here is just of a jackpot with a slot machine, and the point being is everything lines up consistently with a chance to live longer, be thin, prevent diabetes, coronary artery disease, impotence, and cancer by better understanding what's going on with methionine and how it relates to advanced glycation end products. And I was very happy when I realized this just looking at charts of methionine. It'll make more sense in a moment when I go to the next slide. Well, first of all, one point, we talked in a recent lecture about advanced glycation end products and how they cause thickening of the capillary basement membrane. So here's a capillary, here's the red blood cells going through the capillary, here's the blue circles being the oxygen that are released from the red blood cells or hemoglobin. They cross the capillary basement membrane and then they travel to the neurons, your brain cells, for example. And then when you have diabetes or hypertension leading to chronic progressive thickening of the capillary basement membrane, less oxygen is able to get across that thickened capillary basement membrane to the brain cells, which can increase risk of dementia and whatnot. So this is one way. You also make tissue hypoxic. And we talked previous lecture about Otto Warburg and the Warburg effect, meaning that when you decrease the oxygen delivery to tissues, you can induce cancer. When you decrease oxygen, tissues might just die. That's called apoptosis, programmed cell death from chronic decreased oxygen delivery. But some of those cells will potentially transform into cancer, a dedifferentiated cell. Instead of running aerobically with oxygen on high energy production, it runs anaerobically, which is a lower energy production, and it enables the cell to survive the low oxygen hypoxia. So that same thing that causes capillary basement membrane thickening, diabetes, and hypertension, those are also risk factors for cancer. Cancer is much more common in Western societies in the same populations that have a lot more atherosclerosis, diabetes, and hypertension. They go together. The risk factors are the same. Cancer has additional risk factors, but the basic risk factors causing atherosclerosis and decreased oxygen delivery to tissues, they all increase cancer risk as well. Okay, here's an example of a paper on the kind of stuff we're going to be talking about in this lecture. This is really the short lecture on methionine, relationship to advanced glycation end products, relationship to aging, and relationship to cancer, just to get the idea out there. Later on, I'll go through more research studies and sort of solidify it, but here's a typical paper, targeting the methionine addiction of cancer. Cancer needs methionine to grow. Methionine is an essential amino acid, meaning that the body cannot make it on its own. You have to get it from your diet. And cancer cells in particular, they need lots of methionine, and they can't handle methionine that well. They need a good continuous dietary supply of it. And so when it comes from outside the body, from diet, that's called exogenous. Chemotherapy-resistant cell populations, such as cancer stem cells, which drive treatment resistance, are also sensitive to methionine deprivation. So what he's saying there is, chemotherapy, works well for testicular cancer, some lymphomas, and a few other things, but it often does not work as well as one would hope for the most common so-called solid tumors. Tumors of things like lung cancer, pancreas cancer, liver cancer, colon cancer, breast cancer, prostate cancer. So what I see happening in the future, I think the oncologists need to combine treatments more often, in my opinion. I'm not an oncologist. I'm primarily a neuroradiologist. I also was mostly previously an imaging-guided surgeon, interventional radiologist, so this is all just theoretical based on my reading. I'm not telling you how to treat your cancer, but I'm helping you understand it, because people who understand what's going on, they're able to get better outcomes, all right? And so what I'm trying to explain here is, the reason why chemotherapy often does not work is because even though it kills the rapidly growing cells, and you look at the follow-up CAT scan, the follow-up PET scan, and one can see a markedly shrunken tumor, that does not yet mean the patient's going to live longer. because there are sometimes a significant number of what are called cancer stem cells that are in a sense relatively dormant. They're not rapidly growing, and because they're not rapidly growing, that's one of the reasons why they're often not that sensitive to chemotherapy. They also will often have developed multiple drug resistance mechanisms like transport proteins that the chemo comes into the cell, it pumps it out. Okay. Sometimes there's ischemia and lack of ability to deliver the chemo to reach the cancer stem cell, which might be located in the center of the tumor, for example. So what's my point? My point is it appears that methionine restriction can sometimes kill these cancer stem cells, or at least prevent them from growing. So this ability to potentially decrease the likelihood of cancer stem cells growing might dramatically improve prognosis. Okay, so that's a big point. That's a potentially difference between life and death point. That's a useful thing to know. Some of the things I'll share with you real quick. I'm going to make a comment on some of these books. So here's the China study, one of the all-time great books in nutrition, vegan nutrition, written by T. Colin Campbell. And he talked about how with protein restriction, he could basically turn cancer on and off in mice by switching between 5% animal protein, primarily casein, the milk-related protein, to 20% casein, as 20% as a percentage of total calories ingested. And the reason that's a big deal is those are typical numbers of percent calories from protein that humans routinely eat. And mice and rats have similar sensitivities to protein levels with regard to cancer, it is thought. And that's why that is highly, highly relevant. And he tested it 10 different ways, backwards and forwards. Now, T. Colin Campbell also found in his study that gluten protein, like a wheat protein, did not increase cancer growth, whereas the animal protein in those same percentages did increase cancer growth. He also found that gluten did not. So, for what it's worth, those were some of the interesting observations from T. Colin Campbell. This was kind of an incredible book called Radical Remissions, where this lady, Kelly Turner, PhD, she studied all these patients who had survived metastatic cancer. And one of the big things she noticed was go plant-based, okay? No meats, no sweets, no oils. I think I can show you her little quote here. No sweets, no meats, no dairy, no refined foods, and filter your water. Okay, that's all good advice, but you look in the index, nothing about methionine. Even the great T. Colin Campbell, nothing about methionine in the index. Okay, here's the great Ruth Heidrich, her book, Senior Fitness. She's a lady who had metastatic breast cancer in her 40s, and she was told, get your affairs in order, you're going to be dead soon. She said, no, I think I want to run a marathon. She ended up running lots of marathons. You can see a picture of there running marathons and triathlons and set some world records in the senior division, and she's like in her 80s, still going strong. She got metastatic cancer diagnosis in her 40s. And here is Raw Can Cure Cancer. This is Janet Marie Wakelin, kind of similar to Ruth Heidrich. Instead of just, dying when she was diagnosed with metastatic breast cancer, she became a low-fat vegan and was running marathons. She ran all around Australia. And why am I telling you this? Because I'm trying to put this all together for you and connect the dots on the mechanism. So protein restriction in general increases longevity, and it appears potentially to have a therapeutic benefit in the setting of cancer. Methionine restriction in particular appears especially beneficial, and leucine restriction appears especially beneficial. So what's this all about? We'll go to that on the next slide. Okay, so here's what you're trying to do with cancer. Cancer needs methionine. Cancer needs the other amino acid, leucine. Both of those are much, much, much more common in meat. All right. So what you're trying to do is, in effect, like how the Russians fought Napoleon, okay, back in the 1800s. Napoleon went in, this is a painting of him by Jacques-Louis David when he was going over the Alps, okay, but then he went into Russia later after that, okay? And Napoleon was overconfident. He thought he was going to kick Russia's ass, and there's nothing that they could do. He's so much more modern and sophisticated. And basically, the Russians did a scorch and burn tactic. They just said, basically, we're not going to give you anything. When you go into a farmer's field, there will be no food there. And whatever you do, you have no food. Because, Napoleon said an army marches on its stomach. And the point was, they would not give Napoleon and his army what they needed to survive with food. And then they would kind of harass them as they were traveling around. And the point was, the great Napoleon was defeated by, the backward-ass Russia because of this method. And so what am I trying to say? It's a low-tech method that can potentially help you to reduce cancer growth. All right, and it certainly does a lot of other good things. By reducing methionine is a sulfur-containing amino acid, thus it's part of the amino acids like cysteine, where the sulfur group in part gets converted to sulfuric acid, causing a metabolic acidosis, leading to buffering of the acidosis, in part by taking calcium from the bones, from other locations as well, but increase, like the muscle, but taking the calcium and excreting it in the kidneys, causing calciuria, predisposition to kidney stones. Over time, chronic calcium deposition in the renal tubules predisposes to kidney failure. Okay, there's few things more common than Americans over 50 years of age with mild kidney failure progressing. All right, and diabetics progressing to worsen and worsen kidney failure. It can be a miserable thing ending up on dialysis. So what I'm trying to say is it's all good, this restriction of methionine under our context here, and the way you do it is by eating primarily plant foods. I'm going to go into more detail than that, and the big observation that I called an AO. AO means academic orgasm. Okay, why was I so happy? And I'll explain that in just one sec here. Okay, so now we'll go through how does this all come together. So advanced glycation end products summarized in the recent lecture. This lecture here is just a quick summary of methionine AGEs and how they're linked together. And advanced glycation end products are much more common in animal foods. So they're way more common in high protein foods, but also way more common in high fat foods. So that's interesting. And even in the high fat plant foods, surprisingly high advanced glycation end products in nuts and seeds, which is another reason why I'm a big believer that you want to go low fat, even very low fat. There's two major schools of vegan nutrition. There's the one school that says, oh, you need a lot of fat, the good fats they call them. They say get your omega-3s. They're going to say, take flax, chia, eat a bunch of nuts, olive oil's okay. By the way, I completely disagree with that. I'm in the school of very low fat, like Kempner, kind of like McDougall in general before he started trying to gain weight eating nuts. That's a whole other story, but the very low fat camp, and like I see it pretty much like Pritikin. He said, the more you study fat, fat is bad. And I don't think there's any types of good fats other than, a little bit of fiber that you eat in plant foods gets converted into short chain fatty acids in your colon. That's what I call the secret fat. But anyways, we'll get back to all those topics later. But what I'm trying to do, and the reason why I think this is all great, is to create unifying understanding of why something works and doesn't work. And T. Colin Campbell has said this in his China study book, chapter 3, that the more you look for a mechanism of high protein from high meat diet causing cancer, the more you find. It doesn't cause cancer one way after another, after another, after another. It just pushes towards cancer in numerous ways. And that's kind of what I'm saying here is the more you study fat and high protein foods in general, animal foods by far in particular, you just keep finding more and more problems, and it's all internally consistent. And when everything is internally consistent, you see multiple different ways such and such a food is a problem. It just makes it more obvious that you should avoid that. To me, it's obvious that a very low-fat diet is best. And, that was an academic orgasm to realize that white rice, potatoes, and sweet potatoes all have 1% fat. And then there's always somebody who throws a monkey wrench into your thoughts and tries to mess with you, okay? For example, there's these high-fat vegans going around saying, oh, white rice, potatoes, sweet potatoes are not good. They'll increase your glycemic index, your blood sugar level. No, that's a question of carbohydrate tolerance. If you eat a whole bunch of fat food first, then you have less carbohydrate tolerance and you'll get more of a blood spike from these particular foods. But if you're not eating those high-fat foods, then it's not a problem. These relatively pure carbohydrate foods, they actually increase insulin sensitivity. They're good for a diabetic as long as you avoid all the high-fat foods, all right? The high-fat foods make a person fail the oral glucose tolerance test for diabetes. All right. And this is why rice-eating Japanese live so long. They had incredible longevity, the Japanese, like let's say in the 1970s and 80s, before they started so-called modernizing their diet, eating all the fat and the meat. Then they started becoming fat, sick, and stupid like everybody else. But they were remarkably healthy, let's say 1950s, 60s, and 70s, despite the fact they had an excessive amount of salt in their food and they were smoking like chimneys. Same thing with the sweet potato Papua New Guinea. They were smoking a lot of cigarettes too. Okay, so getting to what about methionine restriction? So restriction of that sulfur-containing amino acid that is much more common in meat. They found that in mice, it has a dramatic effect to reducing cancer. and slowing cancer. They found in mice and rats, it will significantly increase the animal's longevity. Okay, so in a sense, it appears to be slowing aging. Methionine is essential amino acid. Humans cannot make it. It must come from the diet. And MR, methionine restriction, slows mTOR. mTOR means mammalian target or rapamycin. mTOR is a nutrient sensing pathway. It's like a contractor getting ready to build a building. And it can't build the building until it has all the available building materials. And the rate limiting steps tend to be two things, methionine and leucine, which are both much more common in meat. So that's the rate limiting step. And when a cell gets adequate amounts of methionine and leucine, mTOR pathway will sort of give the go signal, and the cell will, can expand in size, and then it'll replicate. It'll divide into two parts. The typical somatic cell in your body, meaning not your germ cell, not your ovaries and your testicles, your sperm, the other cells of your body, they only get about 60 divisions, and then they start to rapidly age and die because they can't replicate anymore. And that's called the Hayflick limit. So Hayflick was a microbiologist who worked with a lot of tissue cultures, and he found this pattern with human tissue cultures. 60 cell divisions, dead. Okay, so what's the point? If you've got high methionine, high leucine, like from a high meat diet, you're speeding up the rate at which your cells reach the Hayflick limit and just deteriorate and die. You want to slow that down. And now a lot of confusion comes out of young guys and bodybuilders. Okay, so the bodybuilders are going to want, leucine's a branched chain amino acid. They're going to say, I want my branched chain amino acids, BCAAs. Okay, because a 20-year-old bodybuilder doing curls for the girls, they want to speed up the expansion of their muscle cells. All right, so if you're a 20-year-old bodybuilder, increasing mTOR is what you want. But if you're over 30 and you want to age well, and you're trying to slow down cancer growth especially, you want to turn down mTOR, okay? You don't want anything that's going to accelerate cell replication and death. You don't want to accelerate reaching the Hayflick limit. Cancer cells need methionine to grow. Methionine restriction deprives the cancer cell of methionine. And it's thought, it's shown to do this in mice and rats, and it's thought to do it in humans. So why am I going through all this stuff as well and talking about methionine in the context of AGEs? Well, we already talked about advanced glycation end products, the dietary component, the ones that are exogenous that we bring into our body, besides the ones that are produced internally by diabetes. So in the methionine chart of foods, what I noticed was it's pretty much the same foods that are high in methionine that are also high in dietary advanced glycation end products. So what am I saying? It's a double reason to avoid these things. Obviously animal foods, meat, just have off the charts high advanced glycation end products, off the charts high methionine. So the more you look at meat, the worse it gets, okay? Anybody telling you low carb, carnivore diet, that's all ridiculous nonsense. It's idiocy. It's the opposite of the truth. So whenever you hear somebody recommending that, that's wrong. The other thing too is I'll see a lot of these so-called nutrition experts on the internet, and they tend to be real wimpy, afraid to say anything definitive. But you need things to be definitive. And it's like, McDougall said this, and I totally agree with McDougall. He's the one that's sort of gone a lot farther at coming up with a comprehensive rationale. He said, animal foods are poisons, and you should not eat them. None, zero. You don't tell an alcoholic you can have one drink a day. You don't tell a cigarette smoker you can smoke one cigarette a day. You don't drink alcohol. You don't smoke cigarettes. None, zero. The other thing is, it's been said one of the great weaknesses of humans is they can't understand the exponential function. Okay, what am I talking about there? You've got this cancer cell, and it's got receptors. So let's say here's my cancer cell. I'll put a finger up to project to mean a receptor. Well, guess what? Cancer cells often upregulate their receptors for these amino acids. So there's going to be more receptors. So what I'm trying to say is a relatively small increase in mTOR, which might not be that big of a deal if you're a healthy 30-year-old, that might cause your cancer to grow. The cancer is hypersensitive. It's looking. It wants to grow. It's looking. It's got a lot of receptors. Give me some estrogen. Give me some insulin-like growth factor. Give me some methionine and leucine. I want to grow. So what I'm trying to say is you don't bullshit around when you've got cancer. And if you're serious about aging as well as possible, recognize the meat and these really high-fat foods for what they are. They're metabolic poisons, and avoid them. Okay? of a mediocre, stupid person. They're always like, everything in moderation. I'm a flexitarian, all kinds of the stupid nonsense. This is not social thinking. This is nutritional thinking. And you only want to put good food on both sides of your plate, not good food on one half of the plate, bad food on the other half of the plate. And there are serious consequences for this. Ask any doctor that works in a hospital setting. All day long, diabetics going blind, kidney failure, stroke, heart attack, getting their legs amputated. It's kind of sad and miserable. And you can't necessarily turn things around. Well, I'll just wait till I have a myocardial infarction. Not a great idea. Lots of them present with sudden death. I'll just wait till I'm diagnosed with cancer. Not necessarily smart, because a lot of cancer presents widely metastatic, and it might be too late to turn it around at that point. A lot of patients present with their first stroke, and they're now neurologically incapacitated. So the smart move is to prevent stuff. And sort of the point of this whole lecture is, it's the same foods that are cranking up your advanced glycation end products, both exogenous, endogenous, inside you and externally from your diet, that are also tend to be high in methionine. So you just avoid them and you double win. So meat off the charts. Seeds are surprisingly high. I am not a big fan of seeds. I know that's a popular thing. I personally don't buy it. It tends to be the same foods that I recommended for seeds, like let's say flax. It's got off the chart estrogens. It's very high in fat. I want to avoid fat. I want to avoid estrogens, okay? And these seeds, as it turns out, they also tend to be high in methionine, which I want to avoid as well. Nuts are kind of like, so I'm making those highlighted in red as red light foods. Nuts I would kind of put in the category of a yellow light. Brazil nuts got real high methionine, and nuts are super high in fat, so I don't eat them, except I might have a couple, like a spoonful on a holiday, but no more than that. Never like grabbing them out of a big cup or something. Beans are something that's still a little controversial, in that a lot of the big survivor zones, like the centenarian zones or the blue zones, they tend to eat beans every day. It might be a case of maybe you should restrict the amount of beans you eat. I haven't figured that one out completely yet. So on the one hand, beans sound kind of bad because there are lots of protein and we're trying to avoid protein. But on the other hand, maybe beans got so many compensatory additional nutrients, plus they're relatively low in methionine, that they might not be that bad to eat, just a cup or 2 cups a day, but certainly not more than that. And I'm going to have an ongoing study of beans. I haven't figured beans out completely yet. Grains come next, and then fruits look fantastic, other than avocados, which are real high fat and have more than I would want of methionine and predisposition to AGEs. Fruits are like fantastic. I mean, you look at fruits, they're great. They're really low in protein, really low in fat, high in antioxidants, good for fiber, good for potassium, good for magnesium. I mean, fruits look good. Okay, so what basically happened is I'm searching through all these methionine charts, and I'm thinking about my recent evaluation of all these charts of data on dietary advanced glycation end products, and I just saw it's about the same foods, and I was all happy. I was like, like a organic academic orgasm moment, eureka moment. And it's like, wow, Kempner was right. All these rice-eating Asians are right. Potato power, it all lines up. And I felt like it's like winning the jackpot in Las Vegas. When you see that a theory is internally consistent across multiple variables, that gives you higher confidence that that's definitely the right way to go. So, I mean, what more could you want? Something that slows aging, delays your arrival at the Hayflick limit, increases longevity, definitely in animals, probably in humans. James R. Mitchell, PhD's research, I talked about him recently in my protein lectures. It appears that it's also causing a big benefit to longevity, but that's not as fully established in humans, but it's probably true, I think. So that's the way to go. Anyways, I thought that was interesting.